everybody see the duckies?
Oh my God, we're talking about rubber from conception? You know, this is going too far.
That was a term that was often used in the industry. when we were talking about various products. And next slide. In the rubber business, tires, which we covered in our last session, represent 70% of the volume of rubber that's used. The industrial rubber portion is 30%. And that varies significantly all over the place, all kinds of products. And that's where your conception with the rubber, the prophylactic, and then products for nursing, not nursing, funeral homes comes into play. But there are all kinds of things, and they are everywhere. So what we run into here is that in the tire business, the plants are, except for the recycling, the retreading, but for the manufactured tires, they are huge plants. The industrial portion can be small plants. They can be as small as your house. But in order to produce the rubber, you have to do a few things. One, you have to start with the raw rubber and add your chemicals to it, compound it. So that's mixing the chemicals with the rubber. And then you have to cure it, but between those, it's typical to have the rubber sitting on skids. If they sit there very long, you've got to have them in a refrigerated area. So it gets to be a little complicated. And the other part, but those plants are everywhere. They're in small towns, something like a guy who only makes windshield wiper blades, which you can do in your garage. So I'm going to show you something from India, a video from India. And this represents the kind of businesses that I dealt with, because I covered, I had 32 plants worldwide. So I've been in some varied facilities. And in this one, he's compounding the rubber. He's adding the chemical to it, and then he's mill mixing it. Now, in the rubber industry, you either do it this way. This is the basic way that you mix the chemicals. Otherwise, it's in what we call a Banbury, which is in something the size of a room of your house. Banbury will take anywhere from 500 pounds up to a ton, maybe. And but in this, you watch his hands. He's supposed to be wearing gloves. The gloves are supposed to be slit on the back. And what frightens the crap out of me is that his hand is going to get stuck in the rubber and go into the mill. And I can tell you that I've had that happen. I've had people lose fingers, hands, and on one occasion, I had to scrape a guy out of a press and take him out of the plant in a 10-quart pail. So what they're doing here is adding carbon black, and the carbon black is everywhere in the rubber industry. It is the back of your neck. You can't get the goddamn stuff out, no matter. You take 2 showers a day. You live with carbon black. And that's what gives the body and the wear power to the rubber in tires, but in every other product. Let's have this video.
Is there supposed to be audio, George?
No.
I have audio.
I have audio.
Okay, good.
Can you hear me?
I hear you, yes.
The reason the gloves are slick is so they catch in the rubber that takes the glove and not the hand.
I can't tell what you're saying over the noise of the video.
All right.
Does that scrap get reused?
Yes. This will be reprocessed either in the next batch or in some other way, but it goes back through. And what I had said earlier is the reason they split the back of the glove is so if they call that roll on the bill, the pig, if that catches your hand, it takes the glove and not your hand. This is a very basic press. Now this has got steam. This is steam, probably steam heated, but it could be hot oil, could be electric. And this same process is the way you make a rubber, hard rubber steering wheel.
I thought that was a real scary video.
Well, I'm going to tell you, there's a lot of attention to safety in those plants. It's dirty work, it's hot work, and in what is always referred to as a mill room, in a plant, that's very much, that particular segment is very much separated from the rest of the operation. So, and there can be it can be spotless in some of the products in the medical field, for example. I'm going to talk to you for the sake of you MIT lads. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Boston Woven Hose, which is a division of American Built-Right, or was at the time. And they evolved out of MIT in the mid-1800s, manufacturing fire hose. They were the first ones to be able to make a rubber tube and insert it into the cotton cover that makes a fire hose, and that was the origin of that product. And the couplings were also developed out of MIT. Now that's, as one Kendall Square today. And number one Kendall Square was a dock. And there is still a canal that runs from that building down to the electrical generation station in Cambridge. And the boats bringing the rubber from Malaysia came up the river, up the Charles, and up that canal and docked at one Kendall Square. Now, at World War I, and so that's a category hose. That's one of the industrial products. So World War I comes along, and they're trying to feed the troops in Europe, but they can't preserve the food. Ball in Muncie, Ohio, sorry, that's wrong. It's Muncie, Indiana. It's my error, sorry. But Ball made jars for canning, but they couldn't seal them. MIT came up with the rubber gasket that seals those jars without contaminating or flavoring the food. And that was the beginning of the major plants that were still standing when I was there. That was a notable development. Now, that evolved other products. But you have products made in flat presses. That was what you saw in that little press in that first video. They go anywhere from that size up to 30 feet long and 5 feet wide. They're single deck, double deck, and triple deck. On that is where they make the matting, packing. Chelsea has shoe soling, and Cambridge has conveyor belting. And then if you want to imagine something, on the conveyor belting, Boss Womanhouse developed something called continuous curing. Now, the trouble with the flat press when you're doing a conveyor belt is that the ends show a mark where you seal them together at the end of the press. So you get a press mark. You have to do a pretty good job not to. And so Cambridge came up with this continuous curing, and it was essentially for matting. And the matting that we talk about is what you see on the floor of a bus, for example. The packing is stuff that's usually from big sheets. They'll die cut it for other products. So we have continuous curing, and the way they do that is they have two belts that are endless belts. And they go around a huge drum, pair of drums, if you will, at one end, and then the belt runs along a heater, which cures it, and then exits between the two belts. So you have a continuous belt on the top and a continuous belt on the bottom, and heaters along those belts. Now, they developed that press, and in order to do that, they had to make their own belts. So they bought their steel from Sweden, and then they made a belt that's continuous in Cambridge, ground it smooth, put it on the belt. They tried to sell those presses to other people, but I'm not aware of anybody that bought one. But we had continuous curing. Now that was okay for something very thin like matting. And when you get to conveyor belting, it's thick and you can only make so big a roll. So you can only get so much footage on it. In 1974, when I was running that facility, we had a request for conveyor belting, and we ended up producing the longest conveyor belt in the world. Now, 14 miles from a mine in, I think it's West Virginia, it might have been Kentucky, over the mountains to the Ohio River, and took the coal from the mine direct to the river, emptied it into a bin where they loaded it on the barges. In order to do that, we had to do a little homework, and I picked up some technology in England and in Italy. And what we did was, this was not a continuous belt for 14 miles, but we had a series of cable So we ran cables like ski lifts over the mountains, and then we had conveyor belting that ran maybe 5,000 feet riding on those cables, and one would end and load the next one. So there were segments, but it was continuous transport of the coal. Now, the smaller presses make all kinds of other things. Floor tile, which was made by American Built Right in New Jersey. They had a plant, and the B.F. Goodrich Company, Hood Rubber Company, B.F. Goodrich, in Watertown, made floor tile. And those were made in presses that were probably 3 feet square. And the way that you prepare the rubber by running it through a calendar, which is a 3-roll. It's like the mill, except it's a 3-roll stacked vertically. And you have the color of your base, your background color, running through the calendar, and you have pegs, which is that rolled up piece of a color in one of the bites, and it just peels off a little bit as it goes, and then it wipes that into the base color, and that's how you get the pattern. And that pattern just is whatever happens. There's no effort to keep it continuous. So all kinds of things are made in small presses. There's the extruded with tubing, things like gaskets. The door, for example, on your automobile is an extrusion. That's made by just extruding something round and curing it in the shape that it comes out. There's no molding. Hose. We talked a little bit about the fire. Garden hose is a combination of your extruding rubber into a fabric tube that's woven at the same time that you're extruding the rubber around the perimeter. You're doing the weaving. Gasoline hose. I got a little story about that, but I think we're out of time. And then suction hose. When we were looking at Peru, we were looking for industrial products to expand an operation in Peru. Found that Peru was the largest provider of fish meal in the world, and particularly to Europe. They had to have a limit. I think it was 19% was the maximum amount of fish meal that they could feed the poultry in Europe before it started tasting fishy. But they caught that in Peru, and we ended up putting in a facility in Peru to make suction hose. Now, that went in there primarily to make suction hose, to run from a anchorage a half mile offshore and bring those fish in hydraulically through the hose to the processing station on shore. Now, once you've done that, you fill that market. What do you do with that equipment and process from then on? So that gets into an evolution of manufacturing, which is the same as every plant goes through. The molded things like erasers and brake cups, but you never think about brake cups. Hard rubber. You've got steering wheels. Until plastic, all steering wheels were a metal frame with a hard rubber casing. I don't know that there are many of those left today, but that was a hard rubber product. The battery boxes that you see every day, and the same thing there. I don't know what the chemical composition is of the battery boxes. Footwear. You had the Hood Rubber Company in Watertown. They were early providers of footwear. During World War II, they had 8,000 people, primarily women, making footwear there. They had the largest footwear account in the world, was J.C. Penney Company in 1940. That's a long time ago. And boots. Now that ended up, they couldn't automate it. They ended up moving that south, and then it went from the Carolinas down to Puerto Rico, and that evolved over the last 50 years. There are no shoes, no sneakers being made in the United States to speak of. They're all being made overseas, primarily in Asia, although there is a very large operation in Germany with Adidas. And Adidas now is producing all of their insoles with 3D printing. You've got other products like de-icers on airplanes. We made those in Japan and in Texas. Foam rubber mattresses. They were made down in Connecticut. And then rain gear. Today your rain gear, primarily plastic rather than rubber, but there are some interesting combinations. Next slide. Let's have this video.
Okay. Let's find this one.
Now, while he's bringing this up, one of the things is you're putting out tons, just tons of rubber. And what happens to it? This is one process. And we're going to see it starts out making concrete, but they end up using the tires in that process. We may jump forward, but a little bit, but let's start.
All right, this is the 25-minute one, George.
Yeah, and if you listen, if you get it's a little slow from 0 to 9, and the basics of that 0 to 9 minutes is really talking about the concrete. So if you want, you can jump to 9 minutes whenever you're ready. World War II. There was a lot everywhere. You retreaded your tires, period. You didn't get any new tires unless you had a pretty high priority, and they were rationed. And so Boston Woven Hose also had a recycling facility. Now theirs was a little different, and they stripped the outer casing off of the tire, not the tire itself, so they didn't have the beads or the fabrics, just the rubber. And they reprocessed that to use for retreading. But the bases themselves were used for fuel. And they burned those in a facility down at Kendall Square that heated the buildings that were, there's 29 buildings in that complex. And they used steam for heat for both the building and for the process. And they added the tires to coal and used as fuel. Now in 1970, the Massachusetts environmental people closed that plant because of odor. The company spent $1 million or more putting in the equipment to get the air cleaner. I'm losing my vocabulary. They opened up, operated for a while. The state closed them down again. And then they spent another $1.5 million and then opened up. And that's when the state called them in again, shut them down. And on a conversation with the state, they were asked, they said they had to get a standard that they could live with. And the state had backed down twice. I think the first one was 92%, second was 94 or 96%. And he said, if I get a phone call complaining, I will shut you down. So they closed the plant. And at the time they closed the plant, there was no place to process the tires. So Massachusetts built a reef off our coast, somewhere north of Provincetown and east of Boston. And they built a reef out there, and that's where all the rubber went. Then they started just grinding everything up and used it for sports tracks. So that would go in and say a running track. But that evolved to plastic, and out of that plant, instead of rubber, Boston Woven Hose started making sports fields and did the Patriots Stadium, the Orange Bowl, and at one point were the largest manufacturer of sports surfaces in the country. Very brief time, but for a time they were. Next. So let's have the short video.
Synthetic rubber was invented in 1909, but the technology languished for a couple of decades.
Now.
A shortage of natural rubber during World War II spurred its development. A kind of elastic plastic, it was actually more resistant to temperature extremes than natural rubber. Synthetic rubber reinvented the wheel. We're talking about the rubber tire. Tires for all kinds of vehicles are now made from it. This man-made material is also used to make everything from garden hoses to golf balls. Manufacturing synthetic rubber is now a computerized process, one that takes place under the watchful eye of a control room operator. He monitors numerous computer screens and live camera images. The plant itself is 400 meters long. There are a dozen or more enormous storage tanks for the raw materials, as well as several reactor units. The raw materials include a petroleum-based liquid called butadiene and solvent called hexane. They pipe these ingredients through columns to boil off any residual water, essentially purifying them. This is a laboratory demonstration of what happens next. They combine the purified butadiene and hexane and add a catalyst. The catalyst triggers a reaction that changes the chemistry. The mix becomes polybutadiene, a kind of synthetic rubber used to make tires. Adding another catalyst stops the reaction at just the right moment. The white milky liquid that exits the tank is synthetic rubber. They now pump in chemicals to tailor the rubber for a specific use, in this case, tires. The additives will increase traction and improve wear. A mechanized whisk stirs the additives into the liquid rubber. They pipe the synthetic concoction into insulated storage tanks. Inside, pumps mix it constantly so the additives don't settle on the bottom. Here's a close-up look at the liquid synthetic rubber in a laboratory beaker. It looks like a big vanilla milkshake, and it's about to be coagulated into crumbs. Here's where it all happens. This coagulation unit is like a big kettle. They pipe in the liquid rubber, a solvent mixture, and water. As they boil off the solvent, the rubber coagulates into crumbs the size of beans. The water remains because it has a higher boiling point. The mix of water and rubber crumbs bounces about in what's known as the crumb tank until it's time for more processing. Then they pump the mix into a rotary sieve. As it spins, it drains off the water. They add more water to cool the rubber crumbs. The rubber and water mix gushes onto a conveyor, which is a vibrating sieve. As the crumbs bounce along, the water drains off through the perforations in the conveyor. The synthetic rubber is now a lot like wet snow. Next, it's into the lab, where they aim a beam of infrared light through a sample to analyze the microstructure. If it's acceptable, production continues. A screw-like mechanism presses the wet rubber crumbs against a metal plate to squeeze out more moisture. Another trip on the next vibrating conveyor drains off droplets. Then it's into a spiral conveyor. As the synthetic rubber travels upwards on the spiral, hot air is piped in from the side to dry it. Now mostly devoid of moisture but still sticky, the synthetic rubber crumbs head down a chute and into a baler machine. This machine uses pressure to compress the crumbs into big bales. The bales of synthetic rubber head down a conveyor towards a quality control inspector. This inspector examines them for imperfections. Once he gives them the okay, they head to the packaging station. As they travel through a curtain of plastic film, machinery heat seals it around them. These bales of synthetic rubber have taken about 6 hours to manufacture. And this purely chemical creation isn't much different than the real thing. Like natural rubber, it can be melted and shaped into many different things. Soon this batch will be turned into tires. And that's when the synthetic rubber will really hit the road.
Question for you, George. Just a clarification. When we saw the tires being used for cement production, if I understood correctly, the tires are strictly an energy source and also a source for the steel for the grinding process. but the tire chemistry itself doesn't show up in the cement. Is that right? Or is it a vital resource for that as well?
No, you missed the point, but it was in that he said that the chemical change, the earlier part of that was the mining of the limestone, and the rubber chemistry and the limestone combine in that process to make a actual chemical change of the material. So there is a chemical change that takes place.
So I'm surprised by this, only that I had never heard that tires were an essential input for cement production.
I don't think they're an essential.
Is that an innovation? And prior to this, people were making cement without the tires?
Absolutely. I think absolutely you make it without tires. But I don't know anything about, I don't know a damn thing about
what an insight to connect those two things together and come up with that process. I'm just blown away.
I don't think the Romans used the rubber part.
No, I don't think so.
Well, cement, yeah, cement.
Actually, the Romans used ash, and the concrete made with ash is actually stronger than the concrete we use today, because a lot of the concrete that was made in the Roman times is still up and still functioning and still quite strong. In fact, it gets stronger as it ages. And a lot of that concrete still hasn't aged all the way through to the center of it. So it's kind of a unique process.
And also some Roman concrete was waterproof.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, that's what I was going to say. The Roman concrete made out of volcanic ash would set underwater. So you have harbors formed by concrete that can set underwater. And they're still there today. You can see them off the coast of Israel and Italy.
Right. So to follow on this, we have just historically 1932, we have a recession, and in order to survive, the industry dropped to 6-hour shifts for a 4-day and sometimes only a 3-day week. So they'd work 18 hours. Salesmen would be out there trying to get an order. They get an order, they come in, they'd make the product. So the whole rubber industry went on 6-hour shifts rather than 8, and they went on 24 or 30-hour weeks. Now the Japanese started capturing the rubber plantations and taking them out of business. So there's a loss of source for the rubber products. And you heard earlier that they had, in the early 1900s, started the synthetic rubber. Goodrich merged with Gulf, and they started producing synthetic rubber at that point in time. Now the World War II becomes reality, and the rubber, not the synthetic, but the rubber production side of Akron, sticks with the 6-hour shifts. But then they go to 4 shifts, 24 hours a day. And they go to 6 days. So that's a 36-hour week. And the employees came up from the West Virginia and Kentucky into Akron. Some of them would hold 2 jobs. There wasn't enough housing, so they'd share beds. And someone working the night shift would sleep during the day, and someone on the day shift would sleep during the night. And some people had 2 jobs. They actually worked 72 hours a week. And on occasion, they'd work Sunday. The evolution on the synthetic rubber is that it became a blend into tires and into all kinds of industrial products. But it got to the point where when I was in the industry, if synthetic or natural rubber changed by 2 or 3 cents a pound, the amount of natural rubber and synthetic rubber in your tire changed. You go to 60-40 or 70-30 or vice versa. So they were interchangeable. Today, they're everywhere. They're in all kinds of blended compounds. And in the 3D printing that's such a rage today, there's chemistry going full blast, creating various compounds. And you really got to have your feet, both feet, fully planted in it to follow it. And then I'd like to conclude this meeting with another TED Talk. One more thing on the recycling while we're doing it. They can also devulcanize the rubber. In other words, they can restore it to a prior state. And they can do it chemically, with ultrasound, with microwave, with thermomechanical. And I couldn't find any videos on any of this. But the thermomechanical vulcanization based on extrusion seems to be the more suitable to be applied on an industrial scale. So the supercritical CO2 has been proposed as a green atmosphere that can be used to improve this type of devulcanization. It seems that in supercritical conditions, the CO2 swells the rubber and stretches the sulfide links, making them easier to break. In the last decades, particular attention is paid to the thermomechanical method, those in the presence of supercritical CO2, and finally, the combined thermomechanical processes with supercritical CO2 atmosphere. So that is presumably the coming future, because they may run out of limestone before they run out of rubber products.
Well, hello. And today we're actually going to talk about
You guys can hear this,
rubber.
right?
And rubber is something that is essential to our way of life, but very few people understand that. So natural rubber is what we're talking about. Now, natural rubber is produced by trees and other plants.
Yes.
So this is how we produce it in the world today. So you take a tapping knife and you cut an incision in the bark of the tree, and the latex dribbles out and is collected into those little cups. This process hasn't changed for 120 years. This is how it's still done today. So how much do we actually produce in this way? Well, last year it was 14 million tons. And this is a lot. But how much is it? So what's that elephant doing there? You know, the elephant in the room. So I have calculated out how much that is in full-grown male African elephant equivalents per minute. Okay, so what do you think? Do you think it's 1? How about 2? 3? Well, it's actually 12 elephants a minute collected into that little cup by hand. So pretty amazing. So how did you get here today? And did you realize that you all came here thanks to natural rubber? So who came by a car or a bus? Yep, okay, natural rubber. those tires are 50% natural rubber. And there's other rubber things in that car too. Did anybody walk here today? Oh, I don't see any walkers with the lights, but if you did, your shoes have got some natural rubber in there. And if you bicycled, same thing. And certainly if you came in from out of state, you certainly did that thanks to natural rubber. There's actually 50,000 different things in your everyday life made with natural rubber. So the name rubber comes from the ability of it to rub out pencil marks. And so I had to put the eraser on there as the quintessential rubber article. But, you know, rubber bands. My team sometimes call themselves the rubber bandits. And then what would a children's party be without balloons? Those are made from rubber as well. If you play sports and it rains, which it does in Ohio, you can't catch the ball very well unless you've got sporting gloves on with natural rubber fronts, because they have wet grip and you can catch a ball in the rain. And airplane tires. So have any of you taken a plane flight? Yeah? Yeah, quite a lot of you have been on a plane. Those tires are 100% natural rubber. If you put any synthetic in there, you're going to blow up your tire on landing, or have a very good chance of that. And we don't want to do that. So where does it come from? We use a lot in the States. We import about 1 million tons a year. But it comes from Southeast Asia. This is where it's actually produced. So even though it comes from Brazil, from the original trees, 89% of it is grown in Southeast Asia, the opposite side of the world. West Africa has about 8%, and South America, where the tree originates from, only 3%. Now the USA, we got nothing. So we don't have any of our own production in the US. Now this wouldn't be so bad, except that this rubber supply is not secure. So there's a pending rubber apocalypse that I really think you ought to know about. Now this is caused by a whole bunch of converging factors. So we have climate change. This is warming up the areas and restricting the growth area where you can grow these trees. They're very specific about the climate and conditions they like to grow in. There's also a deforestation moratorium that the World Wildlife Fund is sponsoring, saying you can't keep cutting down virgin rainforests to put in new rubber trees or oil palm trees. This is not something that's going to be permitted any longer. And then, of course, there's political considerations as well. But the most important thing is disease. So this is South American leaf blight, what it looks like. There's many diseases that affect the Conveyor plantations, but this is a fatal one. You get this and you die. And it's made particularly difficult because trees, if you see this healthy plantation, they're all grown as clones. So they're genetically identical, tree after tree after tree. So if one gets the disease, they're all going to get it because they're all growing in contact with each other, only about 8 feet apart. So their leaves are all touching, their roots are all touching. So contagion can spread very, very quickly. And then the trees will die. So what would we have to do? What can we do with 14 million tons? So why don't we just use synthetics? Well, I pointed out there's some things you can't do, and I have a little demonstration here. So this is natural rubber. Okay, this is an example of a synthetic rubber. So we need the natural. And so I got into this over 30 years ago, rather by happenstance. And I quickly realized it's a very fascinating, well, I find it fascinating, biological and scientific system to work on. But when you actually when I got into it, the need for the rubber, that we have to have biodiversity in our rubber supply, became a very compelling thing, and I've never left the field since. It's not easy to do, but it's necessary to do. And so as I've worked on this, I've worked in government, industry, academia. I'm at the Ohio State now. I have my own company as well. This was all to try and make this goal achievable. Get rubber into the US, that we can be self-sustaining and protect supplies. And so there are new domestic sources of natural rubber. So this is what we work on in Ohio. This is the rubber root dandelion. It actually comes from Kazakhstan, of all places. And we like to call it Buckeye Gold. But anyway, this field was in Ohio, and we can grow this as an annual crop. The rubber's in the roots. And then this is wayuli, which is a shrub from the Chihuahuan Desert. And you can grow that up, cut the tops off, extract the rubber, and then the plants will regrow. So you can get a harvest every year. Now, we also developed a new production system for the dandelion crop, and this is a hydroponic system. So you can grow the roots down, cut them off, and then regrow them. So in this system, you can harvest every 2 months. And you can also, in an indoor controlled environment agriculture system, grow them like 12 high. So this can be a very rapidly scalable system if leaf blight did start to wipe out significant production capability in Southeast Asia. Now, the rubber from both of these crops is of high quality, and this is really important. There's 2,500 plants that can make rubber, but a lot of them don't make what the sort of rubber that we need, and a lot of them you can't farm. So anyway, here's some tires made back from World War II for wayuli, and the most recent ones, we have Continental making dandelion tires in Germany. They're all prototypes, of course. And then in the US, both Cooper, shown here, and Bridgestone have made wayuli tires. Now, however, if you think about tires, this is 70% of the natural rubber supply. We can't make tires from 10 acres, you know, or 100 acres, or one hydroponic farm. So we must have a lot more farms and a lot more processing plants before we can make that type of product. So a great deal is involved with scaling up from the original idea. So I've just popped in a story here about the electric car. The electric cars actually predate the petrol cars, but they never got anywhere until very recently. They weren't reliable, they were too expensive, they weren't accessible, there was no national network of fueling stations. So it was very, very difficult for these cars to get on the road. And by the way, they do have rubber tires. So nowadays, though, you can get a Leaf or a Volt or a hybrid. You know, the Prius really paved the way to this. And so probably many of you at this point have something like this. Can I just have a show of hands? But how many of you remember your parents having an electric car in the 50s or 60s, or your grandparents? Yeah, I'm not seeing any hands for that. They weren't available. The technology was there in many ways, but they weren't available. So what we're doing with wayuli and dandelion, we have to develop all that scaling infrastructure. We have to have farming, we have to have processing, we have to have product development, we have to be able to make all the things that we currently make out of natural rubber from Hevea. So this is just showing you an example. So here is harvested wayuli. So we bale that up using conventional equipment, take it off to a processing plant. We have a pilot. Take the leaves off. We don't want those messing up our tires or our gloves. And then we can basically make that wayuli into a wayuli milkshake. So grind it up in water, which breaks open all the rubber-containing cells and releases all the little rubber particles into the aqueous medium. Now we then separate those out from the homogenate like you do cream from milk. We actually do it with a hot milk separator. So none of this is new equipment, it's just putting it together in a new way. And what we end up with is bagasse, very high energy, can use that for all sorts of things, and then also the latex. So this is like the milkshake, and we spin it, and that little tube there shows the latex, and that white is floating to the top like cream. So to do this in new rubber crops, premium niche markets must come first. So wayuli latex, well, here's a bucket of latex being produced. It's got some very interesting properties. So for example, it doesn't cross-react with type 1 latex allergy. It's also very soft, strong, and stretchy. So we can make things like this particular glove. I have an example here. So in our lab, we can make 1 glove at a time or 4 condoms. And it does make, and it makes a beautiful condom, ever so soft and stretchy. And anyway, so here's a nice glove. Now, FDA at the moment makes you wear 2 gloves on each hand. So now your surgeons are doing surgery in boxing gloves. But this one will protect you from disease and radiation instead of needing 2 different gloves to do those 2 processes. Dandelion, well, we've also done the processing for that. So however you make your roots, we then use a water-based process and get the rubber out as a solid. Now, this rubber is almost identical to Hevea rubber, which is very nice for existing manufacturers. However, where's the premium? So we think actually the performance premium will be in things like sporting goods or high-performance shoes, where they're quite expensive, but there's very little rubber in there. You just need to have a bit, and so you can have a much higher raw material price with making very little effect on your retail. So how are we going to make this happen? You know, think about biofuels. A huge amount of investment has been done over recent years in biofuels, even though we already had solar, wind, water, petroleum, geothermal, all sorts of fuel sources. I'm not saying that was a waste of investment, because it isn't, but we don't have any rubber. And there's been virtually very little investment into making us have our own rubber. So what I want to see is, I want to be able to drive down Route 66 or 83 or 71, past the fields of dandelions or of Waiuli, seeing my processing plants looming in the distance. You know, even self-sustainability in rubber will create an enormous number of jobs. We'll bring jobs back from Southeast Asia, bring our manufacturing back here. And eventually, we should be able to make the US a rubber exporting country. So thank you very much.
Do I have any questions?
So I had a question about the first video we saw, that small production mill. How does it work out that it's more economical to do rubber production that way than it is to do it in large scale with more capital equipment?
That's not an economic decision. Once you mix the material, you've got a window of opportunity to use it before it, if you will, air cures. So if you're only making a small batch of something, then you want to mix a small batch of rubber to go with it. And many products are tiny. You take brake cups. Imagine how many brake cups you could get out of one batch of that rubber. And if you did it like you do tires, the stuff would just go to waste. And in industrial products particularly, the compounds are all different. If you're running, you'd be making washers, or you could be making, any hose or garden hose. Garden hose is different from a vacuum tube, is different from something else. So the plants you see tend to specialize on just a few compounds. It gets a little complicated. And when you go overseas, when you go global, you get into markets that are very limited in size. And so you get smaller facilities. And then you get places where they want to start out. For example, Australia wanted to get in the conveyor building business. Well, the press at the time, the efficient press at that time, was a 3-deck flat press, 30 feet long by 4 feet wide. And that was the only thing available to do that. Well, I designed a press was only 10 feet long. Now you move that from a 3-deck, 30 foot, 90 feet down to a 10 foot. And they thought I was crazy. But we put that 10-footer in there and we made some building. We developed some business. That justified a bigger press. And the bigger press ended up making other things besides conveyor building. But that's how we found out what the market really was, what the Australian market was versus what their export opportunities were. So, I had to go to Brazil to make windshield wipers blades. And amazingly enough, there was only one person in the world that we could identify that knew how to make the cutter to cut the edge on that windshield wiper blade so that it didn't streak your windshield when it worked. Amazing stuff. But there's just scads of things, and I'm working today on a real product that the volume is important, but so small that we can't buy the raw material and have it brought in and stored and use it efficiently. So it's depends on what you're doing.
Fascinating. Thank you.
George, in the original video that you showed with the production, it seemed to, they were sort of slopping the various materials onto the conveyor, and it looked like it was going to be extremely inhomogeneous product. Is it in the end, and does it make a difference?
What was that last?
Is it in the end of the process? Is the product inhomogeneous?
Yes.
And does that make a difference?
No, but it makes a difference in where you're adding the chemicals as you go in that particular style of mill mixing. What you put in first and then what you put in, you can spread it across the top so that it mixes in, but you've got to go through that. He's going to go through that process of going around the mill rolls and bringing that sheet around and then putting it through again. So he might put it through a dozen times as he mixes each one. So it's a combination of how he spreads the chemicals on, how he rolls it on the mill, and how many times he processes it through.
That was a really interesting talk, George. Thank you so much.
Much more complicated industry than I knew. It was fascinating. Thank you.